The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. This hour, we're going to spend some time really looking at nations, civilizations, and even those worldviews through history, because we have available at Point of View a number of booklets. One that is out, A Biblical View on Civilization Decline. And in some respects, I did it because we had produced an earlier booklet, which we'll talk about a little bit later this hour, Worldviews Through History, because this particular booklet that came out kind of focused on the fact that we start with kind of this Roman worldview, go through kind of the pagan world, then see the influence of Christianity leading us to the 21st century. And yet, interestingly enough, in many ways, our world in the 21st century is a lot like the first century. But in doing that, it sort of led to the obvious question, and that is, if Rome was such a, really, if you will, stable empire, what led to its decline? And if you want to broaden that a little bit and say, you know, we see the rise and fall of great civilizations. You think of the Egyptians, the Romans, the Greeks. You can think of the Persians, the Babylonians. I mean, the list is a pretty long list. And then you have some civilizations that lasted for a relatively short period of time, the Etruscans, the Phoenicians, and others. And then, of course, if you've read the Old Testament, you sort of see the rise and fall of Israel itself. So what I want to try to do is for a few minutes to really try to look at why do civilizations rise, and most importantly, why do they decline? And this is something that has been the study of historians through many centuries, and it has been something that people have written not only whole books, but whole book series on. So this is going to be obviously a shorter look. But the goal here is to recognize that there are some reasons for the decline in a civilization, and some of those seem to be eluding some of our secular historians. One of the things I'll be talking about this hour is family decline. If you think about it, a civilization, a nation, a society is really based upon the family. So if the family falls apart, sooner or later, the nation is going to fall apart. Then we have the whole issue of spiritual decline. I don't think you can really understand Romans 1, that the Apostle Paul is writing to the church in Rome, without his analysis, which I think is a very keen analysis of what was happening in the Hellenistic Greek world. So I want to try to not only add to, but even change some of the focus on the decline of a civilization. Then we're going to come back and talk about some of these worldviews. And so these are booklets that are available through Point of View. And if you find yourself saying, I'd like to read a little bit more, or as we always do at the very back of these booklets, we have additional resources. So we point you to other books and other resources that you would find helpful. I hope that you will do so. But again, let's, if we can, first of all, recognize that we're going to be talking about history. And really, to answer this question about civilization decline, we have to study history. And that, of course, is the first problem we can put on the table, because historians come to very different conclusions about why certain events take place and what led to the decline and fall of a civilization. Certainly, economic challenges are part of that, and your Marxist historians are going to view a lot of history through the economic lens. If you go back and look at the history books that were written, say, in the 19th century, before some of these Marxist ideas made their way into the university, you're going to get a very different view of, for example, the American Revolution than you do now. Because once the economic analysis began to be rooted into the view of history, you probably have heard that the reason we had an American Revolution is because taxation without representation. I would suggest that what you need to do is go back and look at the Declaration of Independence and recognize that that's just one of about 24 different reasons that were given by the founders, and it really isn't the most significant. But it is an economic reason, so that was the one that surfaced early on in some of the 20th century books trying to even explain something as simple as the American Revolution. Likewise, there are a lot of people that will say, well, the reason Rome fell is because the economy failed. Well, yes, but the barbarians that were at the gate were able to destroy Rome because the desire to defend the republic and later the monarchy pretty much faded away. And so we can also talk about things like social decline and political turmoil that also lead to this as well. But the biggest issue is that even if we do try to learn from history, oftentimes, sadly, we don't learn from history. Some of the quotes I put in the booklet, I think, are very illustrative. George Santayana lamented that those who forget the past are condemned to repeat it. The philosopher, George Hegel, said, what experience and history teach us is this, that people and governments never have learned anything from history or acted on principles deduced from it. Or, probably the famous quote from Winston Churchill, one thing we have learned from history is that we haven't learned from history. One thing we can at least agree on is this. If you look at the great civilizations that have ever existed, the median age or the average age is about 200 years. So you have countries that are in existence today, like Great Britain, that exceed that age. And you have countries like the United States that are kind of at middle age. And so what we see are a number of these great civilizations oftentimes go through stages of birth to decline to death. And you may have, if you've been out on Facebook, seen something that has been attributed to a 19th century historian in which he said that basically we oftentimes move from bondage to spiritual faith, from spiritual faith to great courage, from great courage to liberty, and then from liberty to abundance. But then things began to decline because now it changes from abundance to selfishness, from selfishness to complacency, from complacency to apathy, from apathy to moral decay, from moral decay to dependence, and finally from dependence to bondage. So when we come back from the break, I'll talk about that because what you see, very interestingly, is a movement from bondage to liberty. Many of these civilizations actually came about because of a revolution, came about because of a war or something of that nature. And so as a result, that first generation oftentimes throws off the shackles of bondage, and then the engines of commerce begin to develop, and it begins to be the great golden age of that republic or of that monarchy. But in its success are sown the very seeds of its failure, because the next generation, taking for granted their freedom, their liberty, their affluence, that leads oftentimes to apathy, indifference, and oftentimes even eventually heading back into slavery and bondage. So it's an interesting kind of cycle that we've seen, and there have been times in which those have been interrupted, but there have also been times when those have been almost the iron law of history. So when we come back, we'll talk a little bit more about that, and then move into, okay, if society is based on the family, is some of that due to family decline? I think it is, and we'll talk about that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Why so much anger and despair? That's what you see at environmental demonstrations, and that's what you'll hear in speeches from environmentalists and politicians. The future is doom and gloom, and we're the guilty party. Warnings about global warming and climate change are taking on a religious flavor. A few months ago in a Breakpoint commentary, John Stonestreet said that some of the rhetoric came across like the sermon, "Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God." He pointed out some of the apocalyptic excerpts from Bill McKibben's book, Falter. If you want to know why people are scared, look at some of McKibben's scary scenarios. At the end of the century, he says the oceans may become so hot as to stop oxygen production by phytoplankton. We would lose 2/3 of the Earth's oxygen, resulting in mass mortality of animals and humans. A thawed reindeer carcass in Siberia released anthrax into nearby water and soil. This infected reindeer and some humans. This explains why I've been hearing people afraid that melting ice might release smallpox and bubonic plague into the world. He argues that melting ice sheets could trigger more earthquakes, and he wonders if the new seawater might start to bend the Earth's crust. All this is due to increased CO2 in the atmosphere, but he also warns that we might not be able to think straight because cognitive ability declines in higher carbon dioxide levels. All of this sounds like something out of the book of Revelation, or perhaps we should call it Sinners in the Hands of an Angry Planet. But these are exaggerated scenarios based on lots of speculation and are designed to drive people into immediate political action. As Christians, we're called to exercise good stewardship of the creation, and we should trust in God's protection and not fall prey to these fearful scenarios. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Anti-Semitism, go to viewpoints.info/antisemitism. Viewpoints.info/antisemitism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, talking about a biblical view on civilization decline. And as I mentioned just a minute ago, you've probably seen this idea of a nation going from bondage to spiritual faith and courage and liberty and abundance, but then oftentimes in its success are sown the very seeds of its failure, because the next generation, taking for granted that abundance and that liberty, begins to be selfish, complacent, apathetic, and eventually you have moral decay setting in. And so even though I agree that those particular stages take place, I also think that as a Christian, we can see how a revival can change everything. For example, a lot of people believe that America was beginning to already become very decadent, even before the American Revolution, and we had then the first Great Awakening, Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield. And so that, I think, kind of turned the nation around. Many people say we might not have had an American Revolution without it. After the Revolution, again, you had kind of a complacency, and then we had a second American Revolution, a kind of a second Great Awakening, a kind of a revolution in the social area, in which a lot of those people in the second Great Awakening were abolitionists and temperance movement, a variety of other things, and all sorts of great ministries developed there. And even if you look at the Old Testament, a good example is the book of Jonah. I mean, I think you could make the case that really destruction was coming to Nineveh. God sends Jonah to Nineveh, except he takes a really significant detour. But when he does show up, we do know from secular history that a revival of sorts, a spiritual revival, took place. And even though Nineveh was headed towards destruction, we know that it survived another century. So the point I'm making is that we don't want to call this always an iron law of history. Sometimes a spiritual revival can turn the nation around. And that brings me to the second key point in my booklet on civilization decline. Because historians that are at least open-minded to looking at some of the social and spiritual issues have noticed a very strong correlation between family decline and the decline of a nation. If you think about it, if a family is strong, in some respects, the family unit is a smaller unit of the nation. And so if the family is strong, the nation is strong. If the family falls apart, often it looks like the nation is headed for decline. Now, I'm not the first person to come up with that. A matter of fact, if you want to read some of the books in the back of our booklet, J.D. Unwin is a British historian who has looked at some of that, and it's fascinating because he's looked at this, what he calls sex in culture, and seen what happens when we don't control our sexual urges, and documents that. And then this Russian sociologist, Petrin Sorokin, The Crisis of Our Age, really began to study lots of civilizations that collapsed. And so you have even kind of more secular-minded historians that are saying this and have noticed this. But in this booklet, I quote from a Christian book written by Carl Wilson, which came out many years ago, Our Dance Has Turned to Death. And what he did was he simply looked at family decline in ancient Greece and in the Roman Empire. And then he talks about the various stages. And again, we don't say that every stage has to follow every other one. Sometimes spiritual renewal or revival will change that. But this seems to be sort of the decline, the, if you will, societal entropy in that direction. Okay. The first stage, he says, men ceased to lead their families in worship. Spiritual and moral development became secondary. Their view of God became naturalistic, mathematical, and mechanical. Now think about this, because he's not talking about what was happening in the nation of Israel or what even happened in various Christian communities. He's just talking about the fact that you had some kind of worship of the gods, Apollo, Zeus, whatever it might be, but then the spiritual dimension faded, which leads to the second stage, where men selfishly neglected care of their wives and children because they began to pursue material wealth and political power and military power. And of course, you've seen this in Greece and Rome. Then material values began to really dominate, and you can kind of see this idea that instead it was all about making money, and it wasn't about building up the family. Which leads to the third issue, and a lot of this now is borrowed from some of the material by J.D. Unwin, and that is the third stage is where you started seeing a change in the sexual values. As these individuals began to be financially successful, pursue political and military power, men who were preoccupied with business or war, first of all, they neglected their wives sexually, or in some cases they began to be involved with lower-class women. Or let's also add to that, especially in Greece, but you also saw it in Rome, began to dabble in homosexuality. And so then you began to see this sort of double standard of morality taking place, where, yes, we're married, but it isn't out of love. It isn't even out of a commitment to the children. It's just sort of a societal contract. It's a social contract, but it's not really that meaningful, which, of course, then leads to the fourth stage, because that affects now the women. Because the role of women at home, the role of women and children at home, they lost value, they lost status. Women were neglected and their roles were devalued. Soon they revolted to gain access to material wealth and also to get freedom for sex outside of marriage. Women began to minimize the importance of sex in order to achieve children, and the emphasis was on, just sexual freedom. And even in many of those cases, both in Greece and Rome, marriage laws began to be loosened so that it made divorce easy. The fifth stage, you see husbands and wives competing with each other for money, house leadership, even for the affection of their children. Of course, you have then hostility and frustration. Even now, the development of homosexuality with the children because they don't have proper role models. A lot of these marriages end in separation and divorce. Many of these children were unwanted. Of course, you have in Rome, many of them were aborted. They were abandoned if they weren't the child that you wanted. Sometimes they were molested. They were undisciplined. You had really gangs of undisciplined children roaming the streets in both Greece and Rome, leading to the sixth stage of where selfish individualism grows. It carries over into society. It fragments into smaller and smaller group loyalties. You sort of get almost, if you will, an identity politics. That's a modern phrase, but you see something like it back then. You have a substantial decrease in the birth rate. And so as a result, now you have an older population dependent on a younger population that is smaller than would be necessary for them to be supported. And finally, Carl Wilson says, unbelief in God becomes complete, parental authority is diminished, ethical and moral principles disappear, the economy and government begin to fall apart because now there's fragmentation, there's weakness, and even though you see eventually the barbarians at the gate, in a sense, that's the destruction of that particular republic because it's being held together simply by a dictator, but eventually the invading barbarians take over. And this is kind of the pattern that we've seen in Greece and Rome. But if you've heard me talking about Greece and Rome, you're thinking, sure sounds a little bit like what you're describing, what our world looks like today. Because after all, foundational to a nation are families. Families are the foundation of a nation. When the family crumbles, the nation falls because the nation is built on family unions. A nation will not be strong unless the family is strong. And I thought I'd end this segment by simply quoting from Michael Novak, social commentator. It's been years since we've had him on, but when he was alive, interestingly enough, he said in a very seminal essay about the family this. He said, one unforgettable law has been learned through all the disasters and injustices of the last 1,000 years. If things go well with the family, life is worth living. When the family falters, life falls apart. Well, we're going to take a break, and when we come back, we'll continue looking at this. But one of the things I thought I might make available to you is the other day we had Francis Chan on the program. He gave us a couple of the books, and so we have 3 copies of this book, Letters to the Church. And if you'd like to get a Francis Chan book, what I would encourage you to do is give our pledge line a call. That number is 800-347-5151. 1-800-347-5151. We only have 3 copies of this book. We'll make it available for a gift of any size. We ask for a gift because, after all, we're going to have to spend some money just shipping it to you. So the first 3 people that would like to make a gift, we want to send you a copy of the book by Francis Chan, Letters to the Church. And when we come back, we're going to spend some time talking about this very important issue of civilization decline. All that coming up right after this.
When you give to Point of View, does it make a difference? Jeremy Dyes would tell you that it does. He grew up listening to Point of View in the back seat of his mom's car, and it helped to shape his thinking.
I had parents that were able to sit across from me at the dinner table after we listened to Marlon Maddox and Kerby Anderson years ago and think through what the scriptures say about these issues of current significance in our lives. That's only possible because Point of View has come along and ministered into my life and made me who I am today. And here I am today defending religious liberty, partly because Marlon Maddox and Penn Dexter and Kerby Anderson were the ones that were pushing me towards all that. They taught me how to think through these issues. They didn't tell me what to think. They taught me how to think.
Each gift you give will change lives. Not every Point of View listener will become a Jeremy, but if they listen for very long, they will be changed. And that will change how they impact and affect the lives of the people around them. So make that decision to change a life today. Join the Truth Team and boldly stand for truth in a world of lies, distortion, and information manipulation. Go to pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. That's 1-800-347-5151.
Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today as we talk about decline of a civilization, decline of a nation, and also in just a few minutes we'll also get into this booklet that we have on worldviews through history. Both are very important, and if you're just joining us, let me just mention that I've been talking about the importance of history. We've seen some of the stages that even secular historians have noticed in terms of the decline of a nation and decline of a civilization. Then just a few minutes ago, we talked about family decline because that's important as well. And you have British historians like J.D. Unwin and even the Russian sociologist Petrin Sorokin talking about this, but I quote from a very good book by Carl Wilson called Our Dance Has Turned to Death. And I thought now we would finish up this section by also recognizing that there are spiritual components. And my argument would be that if you've ever read Romans 1, and I'm sure you have, you've probably looked at it in terms of Paul addressing the church in Rome, and there's some great theological truths there. But it's also helpful to recognize that spiritual decline oftentimes leads to civilization decline. Often nations fall from within. Yeah, we see the barbarians at the gate and we say, well, they didn't have a strong enough military, and certainly weak nations are taken over by stronger nations. But I'm talking about some of these civilizations that were so very strong but simply fell from within. And that is sort of the natural trajectory. It's sort of, if you will, the societal entropy, the decline that takes place, because so often what is happening is that if indeed you don't see yourself as important from a biblical point of view or from at least a spiritual point of view, even in these countries we've talked about that did not have the Bible, you still, if you believe in heaven, you believe in a God or gods, there's a tendency then to actually live for more than just yourself. And so oftentimes what happens is if there's a spiritual decline, or then you begin to see a moral decline, you see a moral weakness, and that oftentimes manifests itself even in a military weakness. And there are historians that have talked about how eventually in the Roman Empire there was less of a desire to defend the nation, to find other individuals, slaves, that would be actually put on the front lines to defend the nation, or mercenaries. And so as a result, they weren't the kind of fighting force that you would want if indeed the soldier on the front line is a person defending his own property, his own family. You can see how that would be much more motivating than a mercenary simply getting paid for it, or even a slave being put on the front lines to defend a country that he didn't really care about in the first place. So I think the idea is that spiritual decline sometimes leads to the decline of a nation. And I think we see that very clearly in Romans 1, as the Apostle Paul, writing to the church in Rome, is seeing the decline around him of the Hellenistic world of his time. So let's go through what we find in Romans 1. Because in the first stage, he talks about the fact that people turn from God to idolatry. Although God has revealed himself in nature to all individuals so that they are without excuse, a very clear reference there in Romans 1, they nevertheless tend to worship the creation rather than the Creator. And this, I think, is a biblical definition of idolatry. In the past, this took the form of actual idol worship. In our day, that may take the place in, maybe they don't have idols on their mantelpiece, but instead it's maybe the worship of money or the worship of self. But in either case, that's still idolatry. And a further example of that is maybe even the lack of thankfulness, because they're no longer grateful. They're no longer showing gratitude. Although they have been prospered by God, they're ungrateful. When they're no longer looking to God for wisdom and guidance, they become vain and futile and empty in their imaginations. And again, we see this in Romans 1. They no longer honor God, so in their foolish hearts they become darkened, and professing to be wise, they become fools. So that's stage number one. Stage number two is then when Paul talks about the fact that when men and women exchange their natural use of sex for unnatural uses. And here the Apostle Paul has these four very sobering words. God gave them over. In a society that has lust-driven sensuality and sexual perversion, where that begins to dominate, God gives them over to the degrading passions and unnatural desires. And that fits very much with what we were just talking about a few minutes ago in terms of how in some of these stages 2 and 3 in terms of family decline, you're spending more and more time in sexual debauchery. And either you can spend your emotions and your moral capital to build up the nation, or you can spend that same capital to actually go and enjoy the pleasures of sex and really, in a sense, tear down the nation. And so that, I think, is a very telling turn, because then it says God gave them over. Well, that leads to the third stage, and that's anarchy. Once a society has rejected God's revelation, it's really sort of on its own. Moral and social anarchy is the natural result, and at this point, God has given the sinners over to their depraved mind so that they do things that are not proper, as it says in Romans 1. And that results in a society that is without understanding, untrustworthy, unloving, and unmerciful. And so this, of course, describes exactly what you were seeing in the Roman Empire. And I think also illustrates why Christianity took hold, because while children were being abandoned, if somebody had a disease, they were put out on the streets, and the Christians, at the risk to their own lives, would try to nurse and help those individuals that had been abandoned. The Christians would go and adopt the children that had been abandoned in the streets, and this was striking. It was so different to anything that had been seen in that pagan worldview. So the first stage, of course, is this idea of turning from God. The second stage, about they begin to spend their passions on sexual immorality. The third stage, of course, leading to anarchy. And the final stage, as you might imagine, leads to judgment. That is, the judgment of God rightly falls on those who practice idolatry and immorality. And certainly, Paul's talking about an eternal judgment. After all, he's now going to write a number of other chapters in the book of Romans about what that means, and really begin to teach us about issues like the justification by faith and the rest. So obviously he's talking not only about an eternal judgment, but there's also, if you will, a social judgment that occurs when God gives a nation over to its sinful practices. When that's where, again, those very sobering four words, God gave them over. It's kind of like God says, okay, you want to run your life? You want to abandon biblical principles? I'm going to allow you to actually see the, unfortunately, natural consequences of disobeying biblical commands. And that's exactly what we find there as well. So if nothing else, as we wind down this particular section, then move on in the next segment to worldviews through history, notice that this progression really isn't just unique to the Hellenistic Greek world or the Hellenistic world of Rome that Apostle Paul was living in, because you have seen so often, and I think I've given you some good examples already, of the progression from idolatry to sexual perversion to anarchy to judgment, and that's found throughout history. And we see this perversion and this progression taking place in Greece. We see it in Persia. We see it in Babylon. We see it in Rome. Quite frankly, we see some aspects of that even in the nation of Israel. When the nation was turning its mind towards God in if you will, the Exodus, and then taking the land, there is a great deal of success. Later on, when there is the rebuilding of the wall in the temple, you see it again where they begin to come back to biblical ideas. But you also see times when they turn to their own, where everybody does what is right in their own eyes, and we see what that happens. And so if nothing else, I think we can see how this was a very natural progression described in the Hellenistic world. It's also something we see today in our own nation, and one of the reasons why we need to pray for a revival and reformation, because unless we return to God's principles, decline is inevitable. We come back from the break. I want to talk a little bit about this booklet, Biblical Views on Worldviews Through History, which is something that kind of started this discussion, because it's intriguing that as you look at Rome and then you look at the rise of Christianity in Western culture, in many ways, our world today is a lot like the Roman Empire in the past. We'll talk about that right after these important messages.
California lawmakers are calling upon all Californians, despite religious beliefs, to embrace LGBTQ lifestyles. The state Senate recently followed the state assembly in passing a resolution demanding a change in the way people of faith approach ministry to same-sex attracted men and women and others who identify as LGBT. ACR 99 does not require the governor's signature and does not have the force of a law. Still, it treads into free speech territory. The text of the resolution describes religious views that fail to affirm LGBT identities and behavior as stigmatizing beliefs responsible for, quote, disproportionately high rates of suicide, attempted suicide, depression, rejection, and isolation. ACR 99 also condemns conversion therapy, counseling for unwanted same-sex attraction or gender confusion, calling it ineffective, unethical, and harmful. Some Christian leaders and pastors fear this is just the beginning of infringements on freedom of speech in favor of LGBTQ affirmation. Republican State Senator Andreas Borges warns that to disallow or create the pathway where we tell individuals they cannot say certain things should give us pause. Russell Willingham, executive director of Fresno-based New Creation Ministries, said, I believe ACR 99 sets the stage for future laws that will criminalize pastor caregivers like me who offer an option for those who don't want what the state is telling them they must accept. Supporters of the resolution maintain that religious liberty does not apply to those offering help for unwanted same-sex attraction. Instead, they say, their form of therapy amounts to discrimination. Hy Feldblum served on the Equal Opportunity Employment Commission. Of concerns for religious liberty in hiring decisions, she famously wrote, gays win, Christians lose. California seems to be applying this principle to Christian ministry and therapy. This resolution is non-binding but coercive. The question is, what's next? For Point of View, I'm Penna Dexter.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, let me spend just a few minutes on another book that we make available, and it's entitled A Biblical View on Worldviews Through History. Let me first of all give credit where credit is due. A lot of the material in this particular booklet comes from an individual that's been on this program, Glenn Sunshine, an individual that is a professor in Connecticut. I've had a chance to meet him. I've actually had a chance to preach in his church. He has been very much associated with Chuck Colson and Breakpoint Commentary. His book, Why You Think the Way You Do, The Story of Western Civilization or Western Worldviews from Rome to Home. It came out a number of years ago by Zondervan, and he makes a very good case for the fact that as we move through history, we see that in some respects the Roman Empire and the Roman worldview is replaced by Christianity. And now that we are removing Christianity from a lot of our culture, we're, in a sense, ending up with a worldview that's a lot like the Roman Empire. Back in the Roman Empire, you had this influence of Plato, what was called Neoplatonism. It was a religion, but it was also a philosophy, and it was the belief that there is, a difference between the physical and non-physical. And so this was a worldview that basically had a hierarchy. And because of that, then you had the spiritual, which was superior to the physical. And so as a result, this hierarchy was beginning to be implemented first in Greece and then in Rome, in which, for example, the father had superiority over all of the members of the family. This led to the idea that men are superior to women. It led to the idea that emperors should rule and be worshipped. It led to the idea that slaves were inferior. They weren't even really human beings. They were oftentimes described as living tools. And so in some respects, Rome was successful because of this, but it also had this very ugly underside, a glittering empire, he says, and a rotten core. Human life, of course, because of that, did not have much value. And as I've already alluded to, Romans engaged in all sorts of things. Slavery, of course, was the economic foundation of the empire. Abortion and infanticide oftentimes were regularly practiced. Roman families would usually keep as many healthy sons as they had and maybe only one daughter. The rest were discarded. And into this world came Christianity. First, Christians were very much persecuted. And then as a result, even after that persecution, there was a time in which Christian ideas began to percolate through society. Christians, as I pointed out, really caused a different view because they were willing to rescue abandoned infants. They were willing to oftentimes minister to those affected by the plague, even at a risk of their own lives. They were willing to go and die in these places because they believed there was an afterlife. They believed in God. And the pagans said, I wouldn't be willing to die for this. And so as a result, Christianity began to eventually, after the centuries, began to dominate. And these Christian ideas began to move through the early parts even of the Middle Ages. And two individuals that really helped kind of formulate that were Augustine, writing The City of God and talking about the difference of the city of God and the city of man, and really focusing on and teaching the idea of love and charity and repentance. And then, of course, you also have a variety of other individuals. Aquinas fits into that category. And later on, even in the political realm, people like John Locke writing about these ideas of life, liberty, and property, which seem very important. The development of things like the Magna Carta. And so for a while, you really had this very strong emphasis upon a Christian world and life view. Of course, during the midst of that, you also had the Protestant Reformation. You have the Renaissance. But eventually, it moved into the Enlightenment. And after this, things began to be challenged. There were the beliefs in the past that there was a belief in absolute truth, that our human mind could know that absolute truth, that truth was necessary for society, and that really even that things like the Bible and Revelation would be a guide to determine what is right and what is wrong. But over time, because of some of the wars of the Reformation, people say, well, which Bible do you believe in? Which denomination do you believe in? There began to be a question that people were asking, is Christianity really true? Or which view of Christianity is true? With the discovery of the New World and whole people groups that had never heard the gospel, some people began to ask the question, would it be fair that God would send somebody to hell because they had never heard of Christianity? And so there began to be all sorts of challenges. The rise of science began to be a situation in which they began to say, well, maybe science can give us the answers that theology is not giving to us. And so we move eventually from enlightenment even into our modern world. And so there came to be kind of a rejection of spirituality. No longer was theology the queen of the sciences. Science became the queen of the sciences, if you will. And so as a result, there began to be a development of humanistic thought, Even later, a development of what you might call postmodernism, no longer a belief that anything is absolutely true. You have your view of truth, and I have my view of truth, and other people have a different view of truth. The rise of what's called neo-paganism came during that period of time, even things like the New Age movement. And in some respects, all of a sudden, you find yourself in the 21st century saying, this world that we live in today is a lot like the world of the first century. And I've oftentimes said that the 21st century is more like the first century than any century that followed it. And part of that was simply because if you take Western culture and you remove Christianity, you're really kind of back to Roman civilization. And so like Rome, we value toleration as the supreme virtue. Rome believed that toleration was important because it kept the empire together. If you go beyond the lines of what is considered toleration, you are persecuted, and certainly that is the case. The Romans lived in an over-sexed society, and certainly a society that practiced abortion and infanticide. So do we. Our society does that as well. Rome was anti-natal eventually, as we pointed out. It began to have a declining birth rate. That is certainly one of the greatest challenges facing today, Western civilization, a society that is sort of collapsing because the birth rate is not even replacing the population. And as a result, sexual focus is the focus instead of trying to raise the next generation. And it all brings us back to kind of the key point. We, as a society, if we do not integrate Christian ideas back into society, will be a lot like Rome. And just as we talked about a few minutes ago, in terms of decline of a situation and a decline of society and a decline of civilization, we face some really significant challenges in the future. So I end my booklet by simply saying, so how should we live in this world? Well, first of all, we need to live out a biblical world and life view. Every generation is called to live faithfully to the gospel, and our generation is no exception. That is especially important today, I say, as we're facing a society that's not willing to accept biblical ideas. And in many ways, we're facing the same kind of challenges that were facing the early church. So again, from history, we can see that the early church did live faithfully and transformed the Roman world, and Christians produced a new civilization, Western civilization and Western culture. So by living faithfully before this watching world, we'll increase our credibility, earn the respect from those around us by living in accordance with biblical principles. If you'd like to know a little bit more, of course, we have our biblical view of civilization decline, our biblical view on worldviews through history, and of course, they're always available through pointofview.net. That's all we have for this hour. I hope you've appreciated the look at civilization and worldviews right here on Point of View.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @PointOfViewRTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today. We certainly do welcome your phone calls, 1-800-351-1212. I would love to hear a few of your comments about some things that have transpired in Dallas that have gone national. I have been talking about this more in the local hour, but it has actually reached a fever pitch because of the situation that has unfolded in a courtroom in Dallas, in which a judge decided to offer a Bible to an individual who had just been sentenced to 10 years for the was supposedly the murder of an individual that we'll be talking about in just a minute. But first of all, I need to kind of give you a little bit of a background to understand exactly what's taking place. And as you might imagine, as we sometimes talk about on our weekend edition, this is another one of those religious liberty cases, which we oftentimes talk about with our good friends at Freedom from Religion Foundation, who actually filed some very significant charges. And that's why our friends from First Liberty have provided, I think, a great an antidote or response to some of that as well. Let's get into it. First of all, if you're not familiar, there is, of course, a case that has really given enough national attention, and I suspect most of you are aware of that. A police officer by the name of Amber Geiger unfortunately went into an apartment she thought was hers, and as a result ended up shooting and killing Botham Jean. And as a result, that has led to a sentencing of her. First of all, that she was convicted of murder and received 10 years in prison. Now, that is certainly the start of some of the things we're going to talk about, because after the sentencing, the brother of the individual who was shot, an 18-year-old by the name of Brant Jean, actually, first of all, spoke with the prosecutor, then took the stands. 18-year-old, I just really appreciate the fact that he had a great deal of poise. And he said, I don't want to say twice or the 100th time that what you've done or how much you've taken from us. I think you know that. But he then pauses and says, if you're truly sorry, I know I can speak for myself. I forgive you. Now, that was a pretty touching moment. There have been some times you can think of a church where there was a shooter. You can think of the Amish and a few others where there has been an extension of forgiveness. And so he says, and I know if you go to God and ask him, he will forgive you. I love you just like anyone else. I'm not going to say, I hope you rot and die just like my brother did. I personally want the best for you. Now, to understand that, you need to understand that this whole family, the Jean family, actually were raised in the Church of Christ in St. Lucia in the Caribbean. I've been there before. I'm very familiar with some of the influence there. And the mother, Allison Jean, made sure that she gave all three of her children biblical names. Botham Jean, who was the one killed, his middle name was Shem, which is the son of Noah. Brant, who we're just quoting from here, this 18-year-old, his middle name is Samuel, after the prophet in the Old Testament. And so Brant, the 18-year-old, said, I think giving your life to Christ would be the best thing that Botham would want you to do. Again, I love you as a person. I don't want anything bad for you. And then the courtroom took an interesting turn, because then Brant turned to the judge and said, I don't know if this is possible, but can I give her a hug, please? Well, the judge, Tammy Kemp, didn't know what to do. She kind of looked around, and he said, please. And so finally she said yes. So, interesting, Brant Jean steps down from the witness stand, and immediately Amber Geiger, who's now been sentenced to 10 years in prison, just runs, and they embrace. And while they're hugging, as everybody's, crying, and even the judge, interestingly enough, Tammy Kemp is wiping tears from her eyes. Okay. By this time, then, of course, the Geiger family has been removed. And so then Judge Tammy Kemp goes over to the Botham family to give them consolation. And as a result, then, goes over, interestingly enough, to Amber Geiger, who's still sitting there. And she begins to bend low and talk to this woman, Amber Geiger. And at one point, you can hear her say, do you understand? Because it's kind of like she's talking about something. Well, it turns out apparently she's sharing the gospel. And so then she goes and grabs her Bible. The judge grabs her Bible and says to Amber Geiger, you can have mine. I have 3 or 4 at home. And then she gives her a little bit more instruction. At one point, she says, this is your job. And she mentions John 3:16. Pretty powerful. Geiger nods, and then you have a judge again talking about the fact that you need just a tiny mustard seed of faith. You start with this, and then Geiger embraces the judge and says something, probably says you're a good person, and actually then you can hear the judge say, ma'am, it's not because I'm good, it's because I believe in Christ. You haven't done so much, you can't be forgiven. You did something bad in one moment of time, but what you do now matters. And so she is allowed to take the judge's Bible out of the room as she was then taken to a holding cell, then on to Huntsville. And as you might imagine, there has been some controversy about this. The Freedom from Religion Foundation filed a complaint against Tammy Kent, Judge Tammy Kent, with the Texas Commission on Judicial Conduct, the agency that investigates allegations of judicial misconduct. And, of course, our friends, and I put that in quote, from the Freedom from Religion Foundation are upset about the fact that she actually talked about the Bible, quoted John 3:16, and gave her instructions to begin the process of healing, and even wanted her to handle this. And again, the complaint says, even though Judge Kemp handled a difficult trial with grace, she signaled to everyone watching that she is partial to Christian reform and Christian notions of forgiveness. And then you have some other judges saying that I did not see why the judge did what she did. There have been all sorts of people that are now criticizing that. One saying, once there's an appearance that judges are not impartial, we lose our entire criminal justice system. And this is where then I appreciate our friends at First Liberty Institute. They said that the Freedom from Religion Foundation is protesting Judge Kemp rather than joining the rest of the nation celebrating the compassion and mercy Judge Kemp demonstrated. We should all be thankful that the law allows Judge Kemp's actions, and we stand with her and will gladly lead the charge in defending her noble and legal actions. And then there's a very good quote from Jeremy Dice, and now they've corrected it to say he's with First Liberty Institute, in which he said, what this judge has done and what Brant Jean has done together, I think, has brought more hope and healing to this community than a life sentence could ever have. So as we go to a break, I'd love to hear your comments. Any thoughts that you have? No doubt you probably heard about Brant Jean actually being willing to hug Amber Geiger even after she had killed his brother. And then what about the judge? Is it appropriate for a judge to give a Bible to an individual that is heading off to prison? I'd love to get your comments. 1-800-351-1212. We have a lot more to cover, but I thought we'd start out with this story that relates to religious liberty and the Bible. Your comments right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Why so much anger and despair? That's what you see at environmental demonstrations, and that's what you'll hear in speeches from environmentalists and politicians. The future is doom and gloom, and we're the guilty party. Warnings about global warming and climate change are taking on a religious flavor. A few months ago in a Breakpoint commentary, John Stonestreet said that some of the rhetoric came across like the sermon, "Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God." He pointed out some of the apocalyptic excerpts from Bill McKibben's book, Falter. If you want to know why people are scared, look at some of McKibben's scary scenarios. At the end of the century, he says the oceans may become so hot as to stop oxygen production by phytoplankton. We would lose 2/3 of the Earth's oxygen, resulting in mass mortality of animals and humans. A thawed reindeer carcass in Siberia released anthrax into nearby water and soil. This infected reindeer and some humans. This explains why I've been hearing people afraid that melting ice might release smallpox and bubonic plague into the world. He argues that melting ice sheets could trigger more earthquakes, and he wonders if the new seawater might start to bend the Earth's crust. All this is due to increased CO2 in the atmosphere, but he also warns that we might not be able to think straight because cognitive ability declines in higher carbon dioxide levels. All of this sounds like something out of the book of Revelation, or perhaps we should call it Sinners in the Hands of an Angry Planet. But these are exaggerated scenarios based on lots of speculation and are designed to drive people into immediate political action. As Christians, we're called to exercise good stewardship of the creation, and we should trust in God's protection and not fall prey to these fearful scenarios. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Anti-Semitism, go to viewpoints.info/anti-Semitism. Viewpoints.info/anti-Semitism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, let's take a few phone calls, and we're going to move on to some other topics. Obviously, we have an impeachment inquiry. We'll be talking about that. A very good piece that we're actually going to be using in a future appeal about how there are people that are talking about human dignity but not using a biblical point of view, actually using this idea of human dignity from a pagan view to really convict Christians. So we'll get into that. And I do want to spend some time, and I'll probably do that more in the next hour, on China. A lot to cover in terms of China. For, of course, we just had the 70th anniversary of the communist takeover of China. So what does this mean in terms of human rights abuses? What does it mean in terms of the future of the one-child policy? What does it mean in terms of the military aggression of China? And, of course, even the whole issue of the trade war with China. So we'll get into a lot of different topics here a little bit later, but let's take some phone calls. We've been talking about, of course, the conviction of Amber Geiger for murder, 10 years in prison, and also, of course, the very striking action by Brant Jean, who is the 18-year-old brother of Botham Jean, who was killed. And then, most importantly, I'd love to get your thoughts about the reaction to the judge, the district judge Tammy Kemp, because it has been kind of my argument that, yes, when you're a judge in the chambers, when you're actually seating there, you have to be as impartial as you possibly can. But you are a human being, and after she stepped down and certainly gave some consolation to the Botham Jean family, then it was, I think, natural for her to give some kind of consolation, if you will, and some comfort to Amber Geiger because of the action she took. And so I'd love to get your comments. What are your thoughts about the proper role of a judge in that situation? If you'd like to join us, that number is 1-800-351-1212. Let's head first to California. Janet, thank you for joining our conversation today.
Hi, thank you, and I love your station. And let me just say, I'm 73 years old, and, 50 or 60 years ago, there would never be an argument here. We weren't told. The current generation doesn't understand that the reason we have this wonderful country is because of Christian values and principles. So, the judge, good for her. Stand up and be counted and say what you want. And, of course, the young man who wanted to embrace the gal that killed his brother, this is beautiful. It's a testament to the love of God that he has within him. Excuse me, I get real emotional. Anyway, so, I think good for her for just jumping in and saying, yeah, you can have my Bible. That's really great. Maybe you could clear something up for me. I can understand why she was convicted of murder. I thought murder had to do with intent and all that, but I don't know. Why was it not just like a manslaughter in some degree or whatever?
Yeah, and I think you probably know how I'm going to answer this, and that is that words mean something, and we know what murder means because murder usually has to do with premeditated action, intent, as you mentioned just a minute ago. And we're not just making this up. I mean, the definition of murder, interestingly enough, can be even found in the Bible. My latest booklet on the criminal justice system reminds us that, murder is described there as lying in wait. And if Amber Geiger had been in an argument with Botham Jean and came into his apartment, shot him, and then pretended that she accidentally went to the wrong apartment, and we knew that there was a previous altercation and that it was her intent as she walked in that room to kill him, that's what we would normally call murder. But I also recognize that given the politicized nature of our culture today, just putting down a charge of negligent homicide would not probably have appeased a number of the activists. And frankly, the jury had the option of lowering that. As a matter of fact, even after this action, first of all, Brandt Jean has been criticized for offering forgiveness. Second of all, there have been some that said 10 years is not enough. Some of the activists that I've said things like, well, is that all a black life is worth? And I mean, no, you're reading too much into this.
I know they have to go there.
And so I think this is
the
the problem. And a little bit later, I'm going to talk about how even in the state of New York right now, you can be fined for using the term illegal alien, which is actually in the law code. So we have kind of political correctness saying we're just going to redefine every term. And I think we know what murder is. It implies premeditation. It implies intent. I don't think it was there, but the jury had the option and rejected it, and rejected a couple of different options they could have considered, and ended up with the murder conviction and 10 years sentence. So if nothing else, Janet, you've raised a very good question. It's certainly relevant and something we'll talk about in the future. And I produce this booklet that we have on the criminal justice system just because I thought it would be appropriate, something I've written about in my book, Christian Ethics in Plain Language. But I do believe that it's going to be very relevant in some of these cases in the future. But let's take some more phone calls first. Let's go to Sandra in Texas. What would you like to add to our conversation today?
Well, I just wanted to say, unlike the Freedom from Religion Foundation, I think that the judge was very. I wanted to actually congratulate her for her thoughtfulness in giving this prisoner her Bible. I think honestly, the country would be better off if every judge would give their prisoner who they were sentencing to prison a Bible, and the country would be better off for it.
You know, lots of times when you come into some of the penitentiaries where you have a Christian warden, we've had Burl Cain in here and others, they will try to give a Bible and say, would you like a Bible as you walk into prison? So it's not something we don't normally do. And I think your point's well taken. Again, this, if nothing else, if I can find out how we can send notes of encouragement to Tammy Kemp, I might see what we can do. Again, this has been kind of a local story, but it's had now a national significance. And our people from the people and the whole idea of keeping church and state separate and freedom from religion foundation and all the rest have really been bringing a fair amount of criticism down on her head. And it's one thing to criticize you in social media. Now looks like they're actually filing a complaint. So we're going to follow this case in the future. And let's take another phone call real quickly before we go to a break. And that's in North Carolina this time. Thomas, what's your point of view?
Oh, yes, sir. I just want to say, man, I commend the young man for his forgiveness. And like I told the guy earlier, that the Holy Spirit was definitely in the courtroom. And the judge going down and sharing the gospel with that young lady should be right on point. We still swear on the Holy Bible to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. And if we still swear on the Bible during court, why would the judge not be able to share what the Bible says?
I think that's a great illustration, and I've not heard anybody say it till now. So you win the Point of View Award for pointing out that if we swear on the Bible, why can't we hand a person a Bible? So that's a really good point. And we have a number of other people that would like to join the conversation. So just hold on. We will get to you in just a minute. But the other day we gave out some things, and I thought we might do it again just as we're coming to a break. I'm holding in my hands here a book by Francis Chan. We interviewed Francis Chan recently. He gave us a couple of copies of his book. Now, to be fair, we only have 3 of these. So when 3 are gone, that's it. But we are going to make this book, Letters to the Church, available for a gift of any size. We wanted to do that because, after all, there's a little bit of expense for us just to mail them out. But we have 3 copies of this book, Francis Chan, Letters to the Church. And it really is a great explanation for why he really wanted to leave his megachurch and really try to develop the idea of house churches. So if you've appreciated Francis Chan or you wanted to get a copy of his book, here's what we'll do. You can call the pledge line number. That's 800-347-5151. That's different than the on-air number. 800-347-5151. For your gift of any size, we have 3 copies of that book, and we just thought we would make that available. And from time to time, I'm going to try to do that because we get extra copies of books that they are nice enough to give us, and we'd like to pass them on to you. And we certainly enjoy the conversation with Francis Chan. Of course, you can listen to it again on our website, pointofview.net. Of course, if you call that a pledge line at any time, of course, you can also join the Truth Team, and I'd hope you consider doing that as well. But let's take a break. We've got a number of others of you that would like to add your comments to this. And then I want to talk about the impeachment inquiry. And I just mentioned a minute ago how words just don't mean anything anymore. In the state of New York, you can't even use the term illegal alien. We'll talk about that right after this.
When you gift a point of view, does it make a difference? Jeremy Dies would tell you that it does. He grew up listening to Point of View in the back seat of his mom's car, and it helped to shape his thinking.
I had parents that were able to sit across from me at the dinner table after we listened to Marlon Maddox and Kerby Anderson years ago and think through what the scriptures say about these issues of current significance in our lives. That's only possible because Point of View has come along and ministered into my life and made me who I am today. And here I am today defending religious liberty, partly because Marlon Maddox and Penn Dexter and Kerby Anderson were the ones that were pushing me towards all that. They taught me how to think through these issues. They didn't tell me what to think. They taught me how to think.
Each gift you give will change lives. Not every Point of View listener will become a Jeremy, but if they listen for very long, they will be changed. And that will change how they impact and affect the lives of the people around them. So make that decision to change a life today. Join the Truth Team and boldly stand for truth in a world of lies, distortion, and information manipulation. Go to pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. That's 1-800-347-5151.
Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
If you'd like to join a conversation, 1-800-351-1212. All three books have been taken of Francis Chan, so we'll send those out. And let me just mention in a little bit, we're going to get into some other issues that almost fit the same theme. This lack of any kind of common sense, the attempt to try to redefine terms. I alluded to one of those just a minute ago. I did mention that the other day, but now we have a lot more that we know about. New York City, in particular, the Commission on Human Rights, which bans the use of saying illegal alien with a fine of up to $250,000. And Hans von Spakovsky, who's been on the program with us, who used to be the head of the Federal Elections Commission, is now a legal analyst at the Heritage Foundation, has some things to say about that. And then one of the articles I've actually posted comes from England, and it actually is going to be probably the next appeal letter I'm going to be sending to you, because what you have is this Christian physician in England who lost his job because he refused to call a bearded man who is 6 feet tall madam, and because he used the wrong pronoun, he was fired. And the ruling, as if that's not bad enough, is, and I'm quoting this now, this is the ruling from the court: belief in Genesis 1:27, or also belief in, or the lack of belief in transgenderism and conscientious objection to transgenderism in our judgment is incompatible with human dignity and actually violates the fundamental rights of others. And so they're using this idea of human dignity, not based upon the idea that human beings have dignity because they're created in the image of God, but their kind of pagan notion of human dignity. And as you might imagine, there are a few people been writing about that, John Smerick being one of those, and so we've posted that article and get to that a little bit later. But I thought just a few more of you might have a comment about the judge, District Judge Tammy Kemp, who, by the way, is African-American. One of the arguments they made, which is hard to even take seriously, she's an African-American judge, but some people actually criticized, saying, would she have done that if the defendant was black? Oh, please. Yes, I think she would have done that, whether the defendant was black or white. And if you try to even suggest that an African-American judge would not have done that for an African-American victim, there comes a point in time where you just have trouble even having a reasonable conversation. But let's go back to the phones and see what you have to say about this. We'll head up to Ohio first, WGGN. And Nathan, what would you like to add to our conversation?
Hey, Kerby, I'd like to just thank you for your program first. But they wanted me to focus on one part of my question or my comment, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe the judge and the defendant or the victim's brother waited until after she had already been found guilty and sentenced before any of this happened. So it's not like she said, here's a Bible, you're going to accept Jesus, and by the way, I'm going to make your sentence 10 years since you've done that. It wasn't anything having to do with religion, being found guilty and being sentenced before that happened. So they waited until after the court stuff had been done, all the professional stuff had already been given out, you've already been sentenced. Oh, by the way, the defendant's or the victim's brother wants to say something to you, and after that, I'm going to give you a Bible. It's ludicrous to think it was all religious, because that all happened after the fact.
And I think your point's well taken. I do know of judges that sometimes have stepped out of the bench, taken their robes off to make it very clear that now I'm a private citizen. You know what? Just because you're a judge, you can still be a private citizen. You can still express your point of view. It's called the First Amendment. You can look it up. It's in the Constitution. And those are some things that seem to have eluded anyone. But if you're part of the Freedom from Religion Foundation or a variety of other groups, I haven't heard if the ACLU's weighed in on this yet, or some other groups, then you say, no, any aspect of religion biases you. I don't have a bias if I'm a secular person, but you people that are religious, you people that are Christians, you have a bias. And so they're going to maybe come after Tammy Kemp, and we'll see what we can do to encourage her. And if she'd ever come on this program, I'd have her on in a minute, because I'd love to have her share her story. I did not know, And I do know some of these judges. I've got a son-in-law that actually tries cases in the Dallas area. I didn't know much about where she stood spiritually, so I thought it was kind of interesting to find that out as well. Let's take at least one more phone call, and then I'll move on to a couple of our other topics. But if you want to bring this up later, you're welcome to do so. But let's head to, I think we're now in Missouri, KNEO. Michael, you're on the air.
Hello, thank you for presenting the situation to the public. I think I'm just repeating some things that have been said earlier.
That's okay. Go ahead.
Tammy, the Honorable Judge Kemp, tried the case impartially. She took the conviction from the jury, made an appropriate sentencing, and then after all that was done, followed the lead of the victim's family and the grace that she showed, along with the grace that the family members showed.
Yeah, Brant Jean. Yeah.
It was 100% appropriate in any setting.
I think so, too. And again, I appreciate a couple of you kind of joining in. Thomas talked about the fact that we swear on the Bible. If we swear on the Bible, can't we give out a Bible? Of course we can. And then both Nathan and Michael talking about this happened after the sentencing, after the conviction, after the sentencing, and the rest. And I have said this on other venues, but I don't know if I've said this on the national audience because we've been following this pretty much on the local level. I do know that Amber Geiger has been going to an evangelical church because I've talked to a pastor at that church that told us a little bit about that. I don't know how often she was there. I don't know how often she attended, but I do know enough about this evangelical church to know she heard the gospel. But the bottom line is if she didn't hear the gospel from Brant Jean, she certainly heard the gospel from Tammy Kemp. And I was pretty encouraged, if nothing else, that the news is going out that she quoted John 3:16. And, of course, you know as well as I do that over the years at various football games, they'll have people with the sign that says John 3:16. And, of course, we've had all sorts of various athletes that have had those on their eye black or on their shoes or whatever. And this oftentimes causes a lot of people to go and look up John 3:16, which I would hope most people would know. But then again, this is the world that we find ourselves in. And so, if nothing else, just wanted to put that on the table. It relates to some of the kind of religious liberty issues we've talked about. Very good statement that has come from our friends at First Liberty Institute, and also a statement from Jeremy Dice, who's been on the program with us before. And so I want to move on to a couple of other issues. One of those is what I've already alluded to twice, but let me get into it again. That is the city's, New York City's Commission on Human Rights has actually released new legal enforcement guidelines that ban the use of the term illegal alien. Now, Hans von Spakovsky, who, as I said before, used to be the head of the Federal Elections Commission and now is one of the legal analysts at Heritage Foundation, said propaganda, surveillance, and censorship of Big Brother are found in George Orwell's book 1984, and it apparently has arrived, he says, in New York City. He says, first of all, this is an outrageous violation of the First Amendment, you think? But more than that, just even apart from that, he points out that the term illegal alien is actually in the legal terminology. Here's a couple of cases. For example, you had the case that came down from Federal District Court Judge Andrew Hannon on the DAPA program. That stands for Deferred Action for Parents of Americans and Lawful Permanent Residents. And he says even there in that ruling, the court also understands that there are a certain segment of the population that finds the phrase illegal alien offensive. The court uses this term because it is the term used by the United States Supreme Court in its latest pronouncement pertaining to this area of law. You actually have federal immigration laws. You can look it up. U.S. Law 1365, which deals with the reimbursement program the federal government has for states that are incarcerating illegal aliens. It uses the term illegal aliens in its title and in the statute itself. And so I think you can kind of see that it really is kind of difficult to come at. And then Hans von Spakovsky also says the city of New York is going to punish anyone who uses the correct legal terminology of federal laws and court decisions. And it's so far outside the bounds, he says, of what it can legally do. It's obviously a fundamental violation of the First Amendment and common sense. He ends by saying, Justice Antonin Scalia once time said, day by day, case by case, the Supreme Court is busy designing a constitution for a country I do not recognize. Hans von Spakovsky says the city of New York's Commission on Human Rights is busy doing the same thing. Have a lot more to cover. We will do that right after this.
California lawmakers are calling upon all Californians, despite religious beliefs, to embrace LGBTQ lifestyles. The state Senate recently followed the state assembly in passing a resolution demanding a change in the way people of faith approach ministry to same-sex attracted men and women and others who identify as LGBT. ACR 99 does not require the governor's signature and does not have the force of a law. Still, it treads into free speech territory. The text of the resolution describes religious views that fail to affirm LGBT identities and behavior as stigmatizing beliefs responsible for, quote, disproportionately high rates of suicide, attempted suicide, depression, rejection, and isolation. ACR 99 also condemns conversion therapy, counseling for unwanted same-sex attraction or gender confusion, calling it ineffective, unethical, and harmful. Some Christian leaders and pastors fear this is just the beginning of infringements on freedom of speech in favor of LGBTQ affirmation. Republican State Senator Andreas Borges warns that to disallow or create the pathway where we tell individuals they cannot say certain things should give us pause. Russell Willingham, executive director of Fresno-based New Creation Ministries, said, I believe ACR 99 sets the stage for future laws that will criminalize pastor caregivers like me who offer an option for those who don't want what the state is telling them they must accept. Supporters of the resolution maintain that religious liberty does not apply to those offering help for unwanted same-sex attraction. Instead, they say, their form of therapy amounts to discrimination. Hy Feldblum served on the Equal Opportunity Employment Commission. Of concerns for religious liberty in hiring decisions, she famously wrote, gays win, Christians lose. California seems to be applying this principle to Christian ministry and therapy. This resolution is non-binding but coercive. The question is, what's next? For Point of View, I'm Penna Dexter.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, since we are kind of on the theme of saying that words don't mean anything, I thought I'd stay on that for just a minute, and then we'll get into the issue of impeachment inquiry. A little bit later, we're going to be talking about China and its threat. But one of the articles we've posted here is entitled Human Dignity, a Bible Scrapped Used as a Pagan Spell. And it has to do with something I just mentioned a minute ago, this incredible court case. And if you ever have listened to Point of View any length of time, you know that from time to time we interview and have interviewed both by phone and in studio Paul Diamond, who is a lawyer. Actually, the technical term is a barrister in the UK. And Paul Diamond has been kind of like a Kelly Shackelford or Jay Sekulow. I mean, he is kind of the guy to defend Christian values and has defended Christians who have been labeled as anti-Muslim, Christians that have been labeled as anti-LGBT or whatever, and all sorts of other issues related to religious liberty, whether or not a Christian could wear a cross if they actually worked for British Airlines or whatever it might be. And so we've heard some pretty incredible stories, some that just cause you to roll your eyes. But this one is so significant that Warren Kelly and I kind of traded back and forth. And even Andrew has sent me some material about this. This case is just incredible. And so I'm not going to go into all the detail because I want to get into some of the issues of impeachment and a few others. But this is the case, as I pointed out before, of a Christian physician. Now, he has worked as an emergency doctor in the National Health Service for 26 years. This is a man of outstanding character and has great compassion and desire to do things that would actually be something that you would want to reward. So how did he come afoul of the legal system in the UK? Well, there was an individual who, as I again already pointed out, he's 6 feet tall, has a beard, but describes himself as a what? Woman. And so because this individual would not actually call him, now, quote, her, madam, that was a case of which there are now people saying that Christians could be on the verge of committing a hate crime simply because they used the wrong pronoun. And so, again, some people have said that this case is all about whether I am, this is again from the doctor, whether I'm legally clear to say on the grounds of religious conscience. And the answer is no, I can't call you she or he, not because I want to hurt you, don't accept you, because my Christian convictions simply allow me to do that. And you know how this is starting to unfold. You know, every once in a while, as good as I am at trying to figure out what person's gender is, there sometimes you'll say he and it's she or whatever, and you almost don't even want to use a pronoun anymore because, you know, all of a sudden this is going to get pretty crazy. And so the ruling, which is so incredible, this is the first time the ruling is really taken on the Bible. Usually it says, because of your interpretation of the Bible, because of your Christian convictions. But here the court ruling says, quote, belief in Genesis 1:27 and a lack of belief in transgenderism and conscientious objection to that is incompatible with human dignity. And so here is where, again, our friend John Smirek goes on to say, wait a minute, human dignity, where does that come from? Oh, I know, that comes from the Bible. But as he said, that's kind of a scrap of Christian anthropology ripped out of a Bible, later tossed on the bonfire, and now it's become kind of a voodoo incantation. And he points out that really, if you really start down the road and say, well, the Bible cannot be used as a justification for this, but because of that, we have this belief in human dignity. Where does that come from? Because you just rejected the Bible. So does human dignity come from a belief that evolution is true? Does human dignity come true because Darwin said it was true? After all, The Origin of Species talked about the actual evolution of favored races, which led to eugenics and Planned Parenthood and everything eventually. So where do you get this idea? Because if indeed human dignity comes from evolution, where do you find any idea of human dignity? And, of course, he then takes us through stories about male chimps, dolphins, and all sorts of other things. And I think just illustrates the fact that once you reject the Bible, you can't even use the term human dignity. And yet, of course, that's exactly in that particular court case, and an illustration, once again, of the fact that we live in a world where people just create terms, make up different definition for terms, and we're just supposed to go along and not actually raise some significant questions about whether or not the action that you took is legitimate. So those of you that receive mail from me, you'll be hearing this one pretty soon, because this one is just, again, it's almost like the one we talked about a minute ago of Han von Spaskowski. We're talking about something that comes out of George Orwell's 1984. Words don't mean what they mean, definitions don't mean what they mean, and it's just getting crazier by the moment. But I did want to spend just a minute or two talking about this whole idea of impeachment. Tucker Carlson has written about this recently and actually starts by saying that the president should not have been on the phone with a foreign head of state talking about investigating Joe Biden, just because, if nothing else, he's a political opponent. It doesn't look good. It's not good optics. But he then goes on to say it doesn't raise to the level of an impeachable offense. It's hard to argue that it does. The president, as first reported, did not offer a quid pro quo to the Ukrainians. He did not condition any support from the United States on a Biden investigation. And, of course, it is very clear, even according to the Justice Department, that the Trump administration did not break the law. But the bigger issue is, do we want to head down this road to impeachment? And he has two quotes. One from Nancy Pelosi, who made it very clear that she had said that you need to come up with a legitimate argument for impeachment, and impeachment would really only be legitimate if it's bipartisan. And it's hard to find a Republican that's going to sign on to this. But I think the quote I wanted to use most came from a senator a number of years ago. His name was Joe Biden. This is what Joe Biden said years ago when he was a senator. And he said, while the founders included impeachment powers in the Constitution, they were concerned by the potential partisan abuse. We should be no less aware of the dangers of partisanship. As we have seen, the process functions best when there is a broad, bipartisan consensus behind moving ahead. The country is not well served when either policy disagreements or personal animosities drive the process. Those were the words from Joe Biden back in 1998. I think they're as accurate today as they were then, and it, I think, illustrates again this attempt at trying to have an impeachment indictment without actually even having a vote in Congress is kind of a failed exercise indeed. So let's take a break. When we come back, I'm going to talk a little bit about Campaign 2020 for just a few minutes, because we now have some polling that points out that some of these ideas being professed and really promoted by some of the leading candidates are, to almost a person, really significant losers. So I just want to cite a couple of the polls, which we now have, to help us understand that if indeed the next president becomes Elizabeth Warren or Joe Biden or Bernie Sanders, I'm not sure those two men have a chance, but whoever it might be, some of the things being proposed just aren't exactly real popular with the American people. We'll take a break and then talk about that in China right after this.
There's an old saying that the first casualty in war is truth. Maybe that helps you understand what's happening in America right now. Thankfully, it's not a war with bullets, but there is a war for control. Control of the country and control of your pocketbook. Truth is under fire, but you can help turn the tide by supporting Truth. Join the Truth Team at Point of View Radio. Learn how you can make a difference at pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. Don't let truth become a casualty on your watch. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151.
So what would you do with an extra $500 a month in your budget? Pay off loans, save it, do something fun? Well, it's something you may need to think about if you become a member of MediShare. MediShare is a Christian healthcare sharing ministry, and it works. You can save big time on your healthcare costs, and you don't have to pay for things you don't believe in either. Find out more. Call 855-SHARE-40. That's 855-SHARE-40. 855-SHARE-40.
Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Let me just mention that one of the articles we've posted today, Human Dignity Misapplied. It's a very good article by our friend John Smirik, and we're going to be writing more about this in the future, because I can't think of too many times when a court, obviously this is a British court, but what happens in England sometimes eventually shows up in the United States, where a British court basically says, well, I'm sorry, belief in Genesis 1:27, it's not a defense. What? Belief that you should at least be given conscientious objection because you're a Christian, nope, doesn't apply, because after all, we apply a standard known as what? Human dignity, which if you don't believe the Bible, where do you get this idea of human dignity? We believe as Christians that you have human dignity because you're created in the image of God. But if you believe we're just an evolutionary product, where do you get evolutionary products providing human dignity? I'd like to hear that comment. So that's one of the articles we've posted. In just a minute, I'm going to spend a fair amount of time this hour talking about China in one of those articles. Very good piece by Victor Davis Hanson on how China woke America. Then we're going to hear from Newt Gingrich, because he has a book coming out called Trump versus China. And then we have a number of other guests that we've had on the program in the past talking about this. Also be quoting a little bit from this book, Michael Pillsbury, The 100-Year Marathon, China's Secret Strategy to Replace America as a Global Superpower. So lots of conversation that we're going to have this hour on China. But just before we do so, I did want to cover last hour and just didn't have a chance to do so, some other issues. Of course, we talked about our judge. And matter of fact, that I just heard is the lead story right now on Yahoo. So obviously, she's getting some attention there. We did want to talk a little bit about the misdefinitions of different words, but I also wanted to just give you a little bit of an update on Campaign 2020. It is becoming much clearer that Elizabeth Warren may be the odds-on favorite, because as we pointed out a week ago when we had Dr. Merrill Matthews in studio, he wrote a very good piece in The Hill. First of all, she is very prepared. How many times have you seen Elizabeth Warren say, I have a plan for that. I have a plan for that. Number two, she's very gracious. I mean, whether you like what she has to say or not, she will stay there and take selfies. Now there's been a whole big joke about maybe she doesn't understand what a selfie is, because a lot of her, quote, selfies are where somebody else took a picture, but that's okay. You know, we can have a little fun at her expense. But most importantly, she gives you socialist policies without having the socialist label. And since this week, of course, we had on Tuesday a heart surgery on Bernie Sanders, I really think that's over. I could be wrong, but I think it's pretty much over. And people that have supported Bernie Sanders might say, well, where do I go? Well, Elizabeth Warren, she pretty much says the same thing as Bernie Sanders, and she's a Democrat, and she doesn't have the socialist label, so that's a twofer or a threefer, however you want to look at it. And I don't think Joe Biden's going anywhere either. Now, first of all, I don't think a lot of the Democrat strategists wanted one old guy to debate another old guy. An old white guy, Donald Trump, debating an old white guy, Joe Biden. The optics didn't work for them. And this is why I think a lot of them wanted Kamala Harris, who would then check off two boxes, African-American and woman. But Elizabeth Warren checks off 1.5. You know, she's woman, and she says at least she was part Cherokee. You know, I'll leave that for someone else. But nevertheless, The point I'm making, and the point I want to get to for just a minute before we get into all the conversation about China, is we now have lots of polls that have been taken over the last couple of weeks, which now help us understand that though they may like the style of Elizabeth Warren or the style of Bernie Sanders or even the maturity of Joe Biden or whatever it might be, they don't like the substance. And you can see this in a number of ways. For example, let's take Medicare for All. It turns out that if you ask people if they like Medicare for All, you can get almost 70% of Americans that say, yeah, I like Medicare for All, until you explain to them that if indeed we implement Medicare for All, they will have to give up their current private health insurance, and it drops from 70% to 41%. Now, of course, this is the reason why the phrase Medicare for all is used, because a lot of people think Medicare works pretty well. People like Medicare, but Medicare for All will guarantee that you won't have Medicare. But that may take some explaining. But when you do the survey, and I've got it in front of me here, it drops from 70% of Americans that think, well, we kind of like Medicare for All, to 41%. And that's in the poll before they even understand all the implications of what that might mean. You could drive that down to about 20% if you go into all the details. But I think it illustrates again that there may be a misreading of some of the polls. Another way to get at this, there was a poll that came out recently. Only 33%, or a third of Americans, think it's a good idea to create a national health insurance program for people who are here illegally. Well, you might remember during one of the debates, the question was, would you provide this health care program for those who are here illegally? And all the hands pretty much went up. Only 27% of Americans support the idea of decriminalizing the crossing of the U.S. border. That's been kind of one of the statements by a couple of the kind of second-tier candidates, but it's there. Let's take another one. The whole issue of reparations for slavery. Only 27% of Americans believe that. And again, these are just, very simple, quick questions without explaining what that might mean, meaning that you would have to pay for those reparations. I don't think most people think, oh, that just come from the government. Yeah, well, it's going to be from you, is another one. Let's take another one. Abortion. Find me a candidate on the Democrat side that does not believe that you should indeed have abortion up to all 9 months. You can get almost a third. I think the last survey I saw, 32% of American adults think that the state should make it easier for women to have an abortion. And then if you say, well, we're going to have to raise taxes, only 4% of Americans believe their taxes are too low. And matter of fact, in that same survey, 45% think the taxes they pay are too high. And again, this one probably is not going to show up anytime soon, but only 35% want the death penalty abolished nationwide. And while we're talking about criminal justice, which is my latest booklet, only 31% think that those currently in prison should be allowed to vote. The point I'm making here is not one of these major policy pronouncements by some of the leading Democratic candidates are a winner. None of them are in the 50%, 60% range. Actually, none of them are in the 40% range, other than the Medicare for All, which dropped from 70% to 41%. But again, I think if you explained a little bit more, it would drop below that as well. That's tough. If that's the issue that you're trying to push forward in terms of your candidacy. When we come back, let me take a couple of leftover phone calls. Some of you want to talk about the judge, you're welcome to do so. And then we're going to get into the threat from China, 70 years of communist rule. That coming up right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Why so much anger and despair? That's what you see at environmental demonstrations, and that's what you'll hear in speeches from environmentalists and politicians. The future is doom and gloom, and we're the guilty party. Warnings about global warming and climate change are taking on a religious flavor. A few months ago in a Breakpoint commentary, John Stonestreet said that some of the rhetoric came across like the sermon, "Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God." He pointed out some of the apocalyptic excerpts from Bill McKibben's book, Falter. If you want to know why people are scared, look at some of McKibben's scary scenarios. At the end of the century, he says the oceans may become so hot as to stop oxygen production by phytoplankton. We would lose 2/3 of the Earth's oxygen, resulting in mass mortality of animals and humans. A thawed reindeer carcass in Siberia released anthrax into nearby water and soil. This infected reindeer and some humans. This explains why I've been hearing people afraid that melting ice might release smallpox and bubonic plague into the world. He argues that melting ice sheets could trigger more earthquakes, and he wonders if the new seawater might start to bend the Earth's crust. All this is due to increased CO2 in the atmosphere, but he also warns that we might not be able to think straight because cognitive ability declines in higher carbon dioxide levels. All this sounds like something out of the book of Revelation, or perhaps we should call it Sinners in the Hands of an Angry Planet. But these are exaggerated scenarios based on lots of speculation and are designed to drive people into immediate political action. As Christians, we're called to exercise good stewardship of the creation, and we should trust in God's protection and not fall prey to these fearful scenarios. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Anti-Semitism, go to viewpoints.info/antisemitism. Viewpoints.info/antisemitism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Let's head to North Carolina, WLPG, and Rebecca. Thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Good afternoon. I just wanted to comment on the judge. I applaud her. She probably did know that there would be some kickback from this. I've heard on your program before that the civilization depends on people being civil. I agree with that 100%. We need to train our children's conscience, and how very nice to see it modeled in the court system. And I would also point out that prison is a pretty hopeless place, and this young person was going in there for 10 years, and there's just I can't even imagine what it would be like to be in prison. How generous of someone to give them a Bible to comfort them.
And I do wonder, because Amber Geiger is a police officer, and you go into prison, and you wonder, do you run into somebody in prison that you incarcerated, and whether she'd be targeted? I mean, there are all sorts of questions that now she's headed down to Huntsville. I will try to keep track of what's happening to Amber Geiger, including maybe even her own spiritual pilgrimage, but I think she's headed for some really difficult times in prison. But we'll see where that goes.
I do too, and I applaud the judge. Thank you so much.
Well, again, the judge is Tammy Kemp, District Judge Tammy Kemp. Tammy Kemp, if you happen to be listening at any point, you are welcome on this program. I doubt judges will be on the program. I have had a few judges on the program when they run for re-election, so it's a possibility. If he is, I'd love to hear the story, and I'm sure that if she gets any kind of visibility nationally, and she may, because this is the topic of the moment in a lot of these various websites, we will certainly talk about that and come back to it as well. But again, just an incredible story. And by the way, if you just joined us, you might want to go back and listen to the first hour, because I talked about Brant Jean, who is the son of Botham Jean, who was shot by Amber Geiger. And what a family. First of all, I'm so sorry for their loss. Allison Jean is the mother who's given each one of the children a biblical middle name. Botham Jean's middle name was Shem. Brant Jean, who I just mentioned a minute ago, the 18-year-old, his middle name is Samuel, of the prophet of the Old Testament. And the willingness to go and hug Amber Geiger, powerful. And then, of course, the action by the district judge, Tammy Kemp, to give a copy, actually her Bible, because she said, I have 3 or 4 at home, and then drive her to John 3:16 and say, just need a tiny mustard seed of faith. You haven't done so much that you can't be forgiven. Boy, that got her in trouble. You did something bad in one moment in time, but what you do now matters. And that is kind of a theme of forgiveness. And you might remember, if you listened earlier in the week, to the fact that that was the theme in the book by Ruth Graham, who was on the program with us and in studio. And we've got information about that as well. Okay, let's head to China. I had a caller earlier the week saying we need to talk about China, and I really wanted to kind of do that earlier in the week, but just the way the scheduling worked out and everything, I postponed it till today. So the rest of the hour, we're going to talk about China. A very good piece by Victor Davis Hanson, and he says, in this time of near civil war, don't use that phrase anymore, that gets you in trouble. He says, Americans agree on almost nothing, yet sometime in 2019, almost all of America finally got woke on China. And he points out that for years we've had individuals that have sort of turned a blind eye to what is taking place in China. And that has always been troublesome to me. And it has certainly been troublesome even to the previous host of Point of View, the founder of Point of View, Marlon Maddox. And he points out that there was this idea that American trade and political appeasement would actually help. But he points out that American trade and political appeasement were never interpreted by the people in Beijing, by the leaders, as magnanimity, didn't get the word right, that should be reciprocated, but instead as a weakness to be exploited. And so the argument that was made so often by Republicans and Democrats, let's give blame where blame is due, that if we just keep making more concessions on trade, on human rights, we put them in the World Trade Organization, and we just finally maybe even have them embrace capitalism, that capitalism will lead to a constitutional government. Well, it didn't work out so way, did it? And one of the things he said is, how did America act in such a suicidal way? He gives us a couple of examples. First of all, cheap Chinese labor and lax American laws motivated hundreds of U.S. corporations, he says, to shut down their domestic assembly plants and relocate to China. At least at first, they were free to pay substandard wages, and most were unregulated. And once they got hooked, of course, on these mega profits, then the Chinese government began to steal their technology. I think the argument has been made very effectively here on Point of View during the 1990s under the Clinton administration. That was when Marlon Maddox was a host, and Penna Dexter and John Clements and Kerby Anderson were co-hosts, that some of that technology was actually given to them through the Clinton administration. But whether they stole it, whether they were given it, they had this. And all the time while we had this happening in the economy, what was happening in the universities? Oh, they cashed in too. Because now, again, quoting from Victor Davis Hanson, they began to set up lucrative satellite campuses in China, admitting tens of thousands of Chinese citizens. These Chinese students paid full tuition, sometimes premiums and surcharges, turning once cash-strapped campuses into profitable degree mills. And so as a result, a lot of these college deans and college presidents simply ignored the dreadful human rights record, which we'll talk about in the next segment about that. And so he goes through a very long list of how this happened. But before we take a break, what changed? He says, what finally woke America up were these two unforeseen developments. First, Chinese people and the Chinese leadership in particular overreached and systematically began militarizing neutral islands in the South China Sea. They derided international commercial treaties. And then in a racist fashion, they treated Asian and African American countries if they were 19th century colonies. They unapologetically lifted technology from America's biggest and most powerful corporations to actually use this against the citizens. The facial recognition technology, where'd that come from? Well, right here in America. And so they began to rounding up dissidents, cracking down on Hong Kong and the rest. So the first thing is China overreached. Number two, what was the next one? Donald Trump was elected president, all the while screaming that the Chinese emperor had no clothes. The cheerleaders finally listened and admitted that China has been naked all along. And he said, now we learn whether America woke up just too in time or too late. Either way, no one will credit the loud Trump warning that China was threatening not just the United States, but the world that we have known. And so we'll come back and get into this a little bit more because one of the things, matter of fact, I might as well do that right now since I have a minute, to point out that there's a book coming out by Newt Gingrich entitled Trump versus China, Facing America's Greatest Threat. The book is coming out on, I think it's October 22nd. So I'm going to try to get my copy. And when I get back, because I'll be out next week, we will maybe get into this again. By the way, another book I highly recommend. I want to get Michael Pillsbury on, The 100-Year Marathon, China's Secret Strategy to Replace America as the Global Superpower. We'll quote from that in just a minute. But he points out, just again, this unwillingness to acknowledge reality. Points out that the New York Mayor Michael Bloomberg recently in an interview said the Chinese President Xi Jinping is not a dictator. Oh, really? He says, apparently in this fantasy world of the Mayor Bloomberg, the Tiananmen Square massacre never occurred. In his land of make-believe, he says, police have not been violently suppressing protests in Hong Kong for months. And this week, police did not shoot a peaceful protester who was seeking to keep Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist power from actually eroding Hong Kong's fragile autonomy. I'll come back to that shooting. I'll also come back to the human rights abuses. But most importantly, I'd love to get your comments in this last half hour. What are your thoughts about China? 70 years of communist dictatorship. And we, I think, have seen the true face of communism once again. We're going to talk about the tearing down and bulldozing of churches, the human rights abuses, the one-child policy, and of course, we haven't even talked about the military aggression. We're going to get into all of that as well. But I'd love to get your comments. How should we look towards China? Again, I want to be careful because there are just an enormous number, probably millions of Chinese Christians, which we need to support. But we also need to confront the Chinese dictatorship. And so it's going to be a nuanced foreign policy, and we'll talk about that. And also take your phone calls at 1-800-351-1212. We'll cover some of those issues right after these important messages.
So when people first hear about MediShare, they have questions, some good ones, like, what is it? Well, MediShare is a Christian healthcare sharing ministry. It's not health insurance. It's a different way of doing things, which leads us to this question. Why do so many become MediShare members? Two big reasons. They save a lot. The typical family saves $500 a month, and they feel great about it. With MediShare, you aren't forced to pay for things you don't believe in. Find out more. 855-SHARE-40. That's 855-SHARE-40.
It seems we can't get through a day without hearing how science has been corrupted to support political goals. Media entities have sold out truth for the sake of favored narratives. Even some religious groups have abandoned the Bible to support things based on feelings. So who can you trust? Kerby Anderson and the Point of View Truth Team are your source for real news. Learn how you can make a difference by joining the team at pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. In a world of unending fog, Point of View is a shining light. Do your part at pointofview.net/team or 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour, if you'd like to join our conversation, that number is 1-800-351-1212. And we've talked about a number of things today, so let me encourage you in this last half hour to make it an open line. I'm going to spend some more time talking about China. And, of course, we have posted this article, How China Woke America. That is one piece that is available to you. If you find yourself saying you're raising all sorts of questions about China, is there a way that I could learn a little bit more from an expert on the subject? And the answer is yes. Back in June, it was June 6th, we had in studio Gordon Chang. Now, you've perhaps seen him on Focus, probably on Fox News and a variety of others. I guess I shouldn't say that. I don't know if he's been on Christian programs other than ours, interesting enough. But he has been on Fox News. He's been on MSNBC, NBC, CBS, ABC. He's been a lot of different places and has really addressed that issue of China and was with me for an entire hour on June 6th. So you can find some of that there. But I do want to talk about kind of the Christian perspective on this in part, because we have talked about this before with an individual that's been in the studio with us many times, Reggie Littlejohn. We'll try to see if we can get her back in again. She put out a piece the other day, which I'm going to read significant parts of, because she obviously is looking at this, first of all, from a pro-life perspective. She has been probably one of the leading advocates for a pro-life policy in China and one of the biggest critics of the one-child policy in China. But also, of course, has been looking at that in terms of the human rights abuses, and in particular, the abuse of Christians. So she points out that, of course, this week, the Chinese Communist Party has commemorated its 70 years of what she calls a brutal totalitarian regime of the suffering people of China. And he says, and she says it's even more disturbing about the fact that they unveiled the Dongfeng 17. And we mentioned that the other day on the air, because this is this new hypersonic nuclear missile, which actually seems to be capable of evading anti-missile defenses of the United States and the Allies, could reach U.S. targets within 30 minutes. So this, I'll talk more about this in just a minute. I have a section here on China's military and some of that, also some of the counterintelligence threats from China. But nevertheless, that is the case. And I've just been notified that Reggie Littlejohn will be with us in November. So you'll have to wait a month, but that's okay. She is worth waiting for. So we, again, have her. And, of course, we also have Gordon Chang, who was on June 6th. Let's get into it a couple more. She first of all points out that we've killed in China 400 million. Get that number in your head. 400 million have been killed through China's one-child forced abortion or involuntary sterilization policy, each one a victim of communism, she says. That's, of course, in addition to the tens of millions that died in the Great Leap Forward, the Great Famine, and the Cultural Revolution. Then you add to this, which we'll talk about in just a minute, the persecution today of the Uyghurs and the Muslims and others, the Falun Gong practitioners, the decimation of the Tibetan Buddhists. Oh, by the way, we might, as we talk about abortion, talk about the number that were used to harvest organs for transplant. I mean, this is a brutal machine and country that has been in all of this. And again, the list goes on and on, as she points out, in terms of the brutal persecution of human rights lawyers, the brutal persecution of freedom fighters, turning a blind eye to human trafficking, which will be our next issue here on Outlook, and sexual slavery and all of the rest. So she gives us kind of a quick rundown, and I'll do that and then move on to some others. More than 1 million of the Uyghurs and Muslim ethnic minorities are in political re-education concentration camps. We have, of course, the complete control that the Chinese government has over the media. in terms of control and censorship and jailing of journalists that dare to tell the truth, and even the coercion of the big tech media to prevent them from even allowing certain kinds of searches. I mean, you cannot, if you're in China, you search for Tibet, you don't find it. You search for democracy, you won't find it. I mean, they're just, Tiananmen Square doesn't even exist. Unbelievable. And then, of course, you have the consolidation of all the political power under Xi Jinping. And then, of course, let's talk about the Christians, something we've talked about on this program many times before. You have underground Christians who have undergone tremendous persecution. You've had churches that were bulldozed, crosses torn down. You have pastors and priests that have been jailed, and all sorts of individuals. You have one pastor's wife trying to protect her church from being bulldozed, who was actually buried alive by a bulldozer. Just an illustration of how awful this has become. And of course, on this program, when we've had Reggie Littlejohn on the program, talked about the coercive enforcement of the one-child policy, which we now, interestingly enough, I guess theoretically, we have the two-child policy now, but it still prevents a single woman from having a baby. It prevents anybody from having a third child. Girls are still selectively aborted, especially second daughters. And the senior suicide rate has skyrocketed 500% in the past 20 years. And so you just kind of get a sense of what we have in the country. And so there are various diplomatic actions we can take. But most importantly, I'm at least beginning to be slightly encouraged that some people are paying attention. This one comes from the FBI Director, Christopher Wray. We're not always saying positive things about him, but let's at least give credit where credit is due. The other day he said, as I look at the landscape today, over the course of my career, the Chinese counterintelligence threat is more deep, more diverse, more vexing, more challenging, more comprehensive, and more concerning than any other counterintelligence threat I can think of. And so they are now pointing to China, of course, along with Russia, as some of the very significant threats to the United States. And they are convinced that the Chinese intelligence services are going to exploit and will continue to exploit the openness of American society, especially in the academic world, in the scientific community, and in a variety of different ways. Let's again give credit where credit is due. Dan Coates has been on the program with us before, now serves as the Director of National Intelligence. Just the other day told senators that over the past 1.5 decades, China has a remarkable rise in capabilities. That is, again, in terms of counterintelligence, that are stunning. Went on to say a lot of that was achieved, a significant amount was achieved by stealing information from our companies, by inserting Chinese in certain labs of the United States, or by bringing back technologically stolen properties which China engaged in. And it's, I think, worth mentioning that commentary came just after federal prosecutors unveiled charges against one of the telecommunications firms in China, which has basically been used as a way to steal some of this technology. As I pointed out, it isn't just that they stole it. I mean, let's be honest, about a quarter of a century ago, they were getting some of it, being, I think, even given it by the federal government. And that's, again, a crime that should have been punished. And when we were talking about the impeachment of the president then, that probably had more relevance than even some of the other things that were being put on the docket. But that is ancient history, and whether it was given or stolen, we now have a country that poses a great threat. So when we come back, we'll talk about China's military, and then also, of course, the trade war with China as well. If anything I've said so far elicits a comment from you, let's open up the phones again, give you a chance to join the conversation. Do you think China is a significant threat to the United States? What about the plight of Christians in China today? We certainly should pray for them and pray for persecuted Christians, but at the same time, we need to confront China. And I will give credit where credit is due. President Trump was willing to confront China in ways that very few, if any, other presidents were able to do so. So he deserves credit on that alone, and perhaps on a lot of other issues. So let's take a break. And if you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. If you'd like to read a little bit more, I have posted this very good article by Victor Davis Hanson on how China woke America. We'll get into the military threats and a few other very significant issues right after these important messages.
California lawmakers are calling upon all Californians, despite religious beliefs, to embrace LGBTQ lifestyles. The state Senate recently followed the state assembly in passing a resolution demanding a change in the way people of faith approach ministry to same-sex attracted men and women and others who identify as LGBT. ACR 99 does not require the governor's signature and does not have the force of a law. Still, it treads into free speech territory. The text of the resolution describes religious views that fail to affirm LGBT identities and behavior as stigmatizing beliefs responsible for, quote, disproportionately high rates of suicide, attempted suicide, depression, rejection, and isolation. ACR 99 also condemns conversion therapy, counseling for unwanted same-sex attraction or gender confusion, calling it ineffective, unethical, and harmful. Some Christian leaders and pastors fear this is just the beginning of infringements on freedom of speech in favor of LGBTQ affirmation. Republican State Senator Andreas Borges warns that to disallow or create the pathway where we tell individuals they cannot say certain things should give us pause. Russell Willingham, executive director of Fresno-based New Creation Ministries, said, I believe ACR 99 sets the stage for future laws that will criminalize pastor caregivers like me who offer an option for those who don't want what the state is telling them they must accept. Supporters of the resolution maintain that religious liberty does not apply to those offering help for unwanted same-sex attraction. Instead, they say, their form of therapy amounts to discrimination. Hy Feldblum served on the Equal Opportunity Employment Commission. Of concerns for religious liberty in hiring decisions, she famously wrote, gays win, Christians lose. California seems to be applying this principle to Christian ministry and therapy. This resolution is non-binding but coercive. The question is, what's next? For Point of View, I'm Penna Dexter.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Before I get into some of the military issues, let me also mention that earlier this week we had the shot heard round the world. A Hong Kong protest turned violent the other day as demonstrators took to the streets on Tuesday, which, of course, was the day marking the 70th anniversary of Communist Party rule in China. And for the first time since the protests actually began, according to this article in the Daily Signal, a Hong Kong police officer shot and wounded a protester in a skirmish between the demonstrators and security forces. Videos of the shooting, according to this article in the Daily Signal, spread quickly on the internet. The student is stabilized, I might just mention as well. The shot itself represented the sharpest uptick, of course, in violence as the protests began. But if nothing else, just illustrates again the stakes, which are pretty significant indeed in this regard. Let's talk about the military for just a minute. We'll also talk about trade war, and if we run out of time, well, we'll certainly try to cover that another day. New Defense Department report that warns that China's military buildup is reaching the point where it will attempt to impose its will on the region and beyond. Visiting recently with senior officials, interestingly enough, from two allies in the region, which would be Japan and Singapore, that gave this author, I should say, James Stedverdis, a visceral feeling of how things look on the ground and at sea. And he went on, one of the officials actually said from Japan, "We are deeply concerned about the U.S. long-term commitment in the region, starting with troops in South Korea, especially in face of China and their determined military expansion." What they're talking about is I wish we had a opportunity to show this on a screen, but you can kind of in your mind's eye for just a minute, imagine that there are various islands outside of China. And if you want to look at kind of this island area, this, if you will, demarcation running from, say, Japan to Indonesia, this island chain, you're starting to see China more and more trying to take over different parts. And so Japan in particular faces challenges from Beijing. That is partially because of the conflict between Japan and China in the Second World War, but also going all the way back to the Sino-Japanese War more than a century ago. And so the first island chain we want to talk about, Japan on the top, Singapore on the bottom, anchors kind of the north and south ends of these island chains. Then we have another island chain, and that encompasses, and this gets close to our very vital interest, encompasses Hawaii and Alaska before dropping down to New Zealand. This has kind of been seen as the kind of the last final line of strategic demarcation between the United States and China. But now you're starting to see some analysts are also beginning to talk about a fourth and even a fifth island chain in the Indian Ocean and a variety of others that we could talk about as well. So the taking over of some of these islands, the projecting force through aircraft carriers and others is certainly an important issue. And so I want to take a call that kind of gets us into that conversation. Let's go to North Carolina. Mike, I appreciate you joining us today here on Point of View.
Hi. My comment was about the ability of the Chinese to operate aircraft carriers. From what my understanding is, they have an aircraft carrier, or more recently they just initiated another one, but they can't recover the aircraft. They have to stay within the boundaries of the aircraft have to land on land bases.
Yeah, that's something.
Can't,
yeah.
Yeah, because of a number of things, one of which the pilot's defecting, but also these people are conscripted. They're not free, and they're under threat of harm to themselves and their families if they don't operate this vessel. Yet, so they can't really count on these people to recover the aircraft, which essentially makes it, ineffective.
Yes, it sure does. And a good illustration there that there are people in China, as there were in Cuba and other places, where if they can get away, they'll get away. And so that's why they don't want to have the ability to get too far away from the mainland, too far away from the aircraft carrier, because they could land on an American aircraft carrier or something of that, or another island. And so this is the problem when you have a totalitarian regime. There are people that want to escape, and so, like you said, they're conscripted, and as a result, you don't have the same kind of esprit de corps that you have, for example, in the American military. So, really good point.
Precisely, yeah. Good. That's it. You can't count on these people to fight for enslavement. You can count on them to fight for freedom.
Yes, very good. Mike, I appreciate you calling in. That was a great addition to our conversation. And just because we're almost out of time, let me just mention that one of the things we're still watching, of course, is this ongoing battle over a trade war. And right now, as this particular article points out from our friends at the Wall Street Journal, Americans are still, at least some Americans, not all, are giving President Trump the benefit of the doubt in his tariff strategy. But nevertheless, these tariffs end up being kind of taxes that raise the price of Chinese goods for American consumers and producers. They also raise the price of domestic goods that compete with Chinese imports. So it hasn't been very helpful to the American economy, but it is perhaps harming China even more than we might have imagined. There are a number of reports coming out that now even some of these investors are saying maybe China has been really dramatically inflating their economic success. And that's why they're starting to rely upon maybe some of these satellite pictures and others to determine, is there really that much economic activity taking place in China right now? Because indeed they are having some very significant economic challenges. So that's something we'll be talking about. And of course, as I mentioned just a few minutes ago, I want to certainly spend some time, if we can get Newt Gingrich on the program. I would love to get him on as we talk about his book when it comes out in a couple of weeks, Trump versus China. Even if we can't get him on, I'll read the book and pass it on to you. And one of the books that we will be getting into in the future is this book by Michael Pillsbury entitled The 100-Year Marathon, because he said that for more than 40 years, the United States has helped China develop a booming economy, take its place on the world stage in the belief that China's rise will bring us cooperation, diplomacy, and free trade. But that's, of course, not what has happened. And he makes a very strong case for what China has been trying to accomplish and how our attempt to try to reach out, encourage them to be more open, to actually encourage them to adopt capitalism, has actually been used by Xi Jinping to control the Chinese country even more so and to persecute so many Christians. So that is a topic we will address in the future, but since this was the 70th anniversary of the Chinese Communists, I thought it would be worth covering. Was going to cover it earlier in the week, but I'm glad we had a chance to cover it today here on Point of View. Well, I hope you'll be with us next week. I'm going to be out teaching, but you're going to have a chance to hear from a number of guests that will be in studio with us and by phone. We'll have Penna Dexter hosting most of those days, and I think it's just going to be a great opportunity for you to hear a little bit more. We'll continue to follow what's happening in terms of the impeachment inquiry. We'll look at Campaign 2020, and we'll get into a variety of different topics that will surface as time goes on. And in case you are interested, Penna Dexter's commentary today is about the attempt in California to micromanage California's ministers. So that is one of the arguments that she makes, and it's a very good viewpoints commentary. My commentary today is about the angry planet and the attempt to try to scare everybody into adopting the Green New Deal. All of it's available at our website, pointofview.net. I hope you'll sign up to get the viewpoints commentary. As always, I want to thank Andrew for his help engineering. I want to thank Steve for his help producing the program. Hope you have a great weekend. We'll see you back here tomorrow on Monday, right here on Point of View.
There's an old saying that the first casualty in war is truth. Maybe that helps you understand what's happening in America right now. Thankfully, it's not a war with bullets, but there is a war for control. Control of the country and control of your pocketbook. Truth is under fire, but you can help turn the tide by supporting truth. Join the Truth Team at Point of View Radio. Learn how you can make a difference at pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. Don't let truth become a casualty on your watch. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151.
So what would you do with an extra $500 a month in your budget? Pay off loans, save it, do something fun? Well, it's something you may need to think about if you become a member of MediShare. MediShare is a Christian healthcare sharing ministry, and it works. You can save big time on your healthcare costs, and you don't have to pay for things you don't believe in either. Find out more. Call 855-SHARE-40. That's 855-SHARE-40. 855-SHARE-40.
Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.